Okay, Blizzard, I know I've had a lot of crazy ideas over the years, but I need you to hear me out on this one, okay? So, World of Warcraft, The War Within. If you drop the, then the acronym is WOWWW. Wow. Basically, there's never been a better time to get Owen Wilson involved in a World of Warcraft advertisement. I think you should go for it. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Sounds Good Makes Sense, a discussion show for the World of Warcraft player. My name is Devilor, and today I was gonna talk about the Mists of Pandaria WoW remix that was coming out, but we got bigger fish to fry. The World of Warcraft alpha for the War Within is imminent. In fact, I'm recording this video on Wednesday. It's actually possible that by the time this video goes up on Thursday, the alpha will already be live and we'll already be able to dig in and really see what's really going on there. And also on top of that, there's a handful of content creators that have gotten early access to it as well. So we're able to dig through some of what they've been talking about, some of the interviews and stuff that they've been able to conduct, and some of the other information that's been coming out about the War Within in the wake of this imminent alpha. So I've got a list of basically just random topics that were things that I was noticing as I was going through all the information that came out today that I would like to talk about a little bit and share some thoughts and opinions on what we can expect going into the War Within alpha, as well as some thoughts of things that I'm hoping we will see based on some information that we've already gotten. This also serves as a good opportunity for me to go back and talk about some of the topics that are related to the War Within that we haven't done an SGMS episode for yet because, well, I didn't start doing Sounds Good Makes Sense until a little while after after BlizzCon when all this stuff was announced, and it felt a little bit weird to go back to those topics at that point. But now with the alpha imminent, it's a great time to revisit some things and talk about some of the reveals that were made at BlizzCon about the War Within and about some of the topics that are, or the content that'll be coming in that expansion. So we're going to start that off by talking a little bit about delves. Based on what Blizzard announced at BlizzCon and also what we've seen so far from footage coming out of the alpha early access period that some creators got their hands on, these seem to basically just be the latest in the series of experiments along the lines of things like starting all the way with scenarios back in Mists of Pandaria, I guess kind of including islands in there. But more recently, things like Torghast, where it's essentially a single player. You can bring other people, but it's mostly designed around single player, quote unquote instance, not really an instance, just some single player content to be able to do to advance your character in some way and also get a little bit of extra exploration of the world and what else is going on in it. Now, the biggest question that I'm going to have about delves, and as I'm going to be looking towards learning more about these once we can really get our hands on them and really start to understand how they fit together, is where exactly do these fall at endgame? They certainly seem so far like an interesting way for like the questing and the story flow to have just this extra tool that they can use to tell little bits of extra pieces of story and so on while you're leveling. But the real question to me is, where do these fit in at endgame? Because Blizzard has said in the past, they announced this at BlizzCon, that they're planning for delves to be this like extra pillar of like outdoor world content and an actual like motivation for people to go and do these things if they're maybe less interested in raiding or Mythic Plus. And from the coverage that's coming out of this little like early access period to the War Within alpha so far for these select content creators, most of what I've seen about those has been saying that they feel kind of face roll, but that's like to be expected because these are tier 1 and tier 2 that goes all the way up to tier 10. These are tier 1 and tier 2 are all that they had access to in this early access period of the alpha. And those are just basically there to be like an extra layer on top of your questing. These aren't like the actual progression element of delves. These are just there to be kind of face roll. And so it's possible that these still turn out to be something really substantial at endgame. It's also possible that they end up still just kind of being kind of face roll. To me, the big question is going to be partially of the difficulty, kind of like I was just saying, but also partially like where do these end up fitting in terms of the overall rewards landscape? The thing about content like this, and we've seen this with lots of different things in the past, like Torghast is a great example, but also things like scenarios, islands, even a little bit from things like Ashran during the Warlords of Draenor beta. This stuff can be really, really super fun. And then once the reward structure comes into place and players start thinking more about how to use this content to advance their character and less about what the core element of the gameplay for the content is, it ends up getting really, really frustrating to play because you either have to optimize around doing it in a specific way or you feel forced into doing it, even though like it's something that you kind of wanted to do sometimes just for fun, but now you have to go in there every day or whatever. There's lots of different ways that how this ends up factoring into the reward structure overall could be problematic. And I think Blizzard understands that and is approaching that or approaching testing it with that in mind this time around, because they are talking about the rewards very early. A lot of the other things that I talked about in the past, they were mostly just talking about like, what do you do in this? Like, how do you actually participate in an island? What is an island? How do you actually participate in Astran? What is it? And then the rewards were something that they sort of figured out later once they had put the gameplay in place, not necessarily completely understanding how that was going to affect the way that players approach that in terms of gameplay. That's the problem way to do it. This time around, they're actually involving the rewards and they're actually talking about and thinking about the rewards from the beginning. So we know that there's some really cool cosmetic rewards that you can get from it, like the that customizable mount that looks super cool. Like it's got all these different sort of like airplane elements to it, airship elements to it. It looks really cool. But also apparently heroic level gear will be accessible from these delves as well. And that feels like a good way for that to end up. It's really just going to be a question of, does this then supplant wanting to do other content that maybe someone is still interested in favor of going and doing delves instead? I feel like the sort of ideal place for delves to end up is that they don't feel as fast or as overall lucrative as something like Mythic Plus or as something like Heroic Rating in terms of like the speed at which you get those gear. But they can still feel like decent supplementary content to that, where if you just want to log in and play for a little bit and your Mythic Plus group isn't around or it's not raid time or whatever, you can go and do some delves if you feel like it. Or something where maybe if you're a player who's just not interested in doing that content at all, you still have some level of progression that you can slowly catch up, but you're never going to completely overtake someone who's more focused on Mythic Plus or more focused on rating. That kind of feels like the sweet spot for where they should fall in terms of gear, but we will see. It's kind of like I said, sort of a new take on the sort of experimental line of things like Torghast in the past. And I hope at the very least that they end up being something that's fun to play first and foremost, but that they are then the reward structure for them is built in such a way that doesn't erase that fun by making them like mandatory or making them extra grindy or anything else along those lines. We're going to move on from that. I'm sure delves will be something that I end up talking a lot more about in the future. Those are just kind of where my head's at right now. And with some of the information we've learned about them coming out of the alpha. But I want to move on a little bit more because I've got a bunch of different things I want to get to. Let's talk about warbands real quick. So we don't have a ton of new information about warbands just yet. We kind of knew most of what's being seen, at least currently from the alpha. Things like you'll be able to trade, like you'll have a warband bank that you can trade things back and forth between your characters very easily. You have the ability to trade gold as well between your characters very easily. The character select screen is changing, so that you see like your favorite 4 characters sitting there. This is all really cool stuff and stuff that I'm excited for, but it's things that we've known pretty much since BlizzCon that was going to be coming in. What is interesting is a lot of the way that Blizzard is talking about warbands as this alpha is rolling out. They're really pushing a lot on the philosophical aspect of converting essentially World of Warcraft into a game where everything is account wide, where you play as a player and you have an account, and that account is what's gaining the progress, not so much necessarily individual characters outside of, like obviously you level up your paladin still, you level up your shaman still. But when you earn rewards in the game, those rewards are things that can benefit all of the characters on your account. That's kind of this philosophical shift that they're starting to make. One big comparison that people have been making for years between World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV is that in Final Fantasy XIV, you just have the one character. Well, you can have multiple characters, but there's kind of no reason to, because on that one character, you can kind of do everything. You can go and learn these different jobs. You can go and learn these different professions, and you level all those up individually, and you just switch between them, essentially, whenever you want to do that. World of Warcraft seems to kind of be heading in a direction where it's still not just that one character, right? It's still not just your one dude that does everything themselves and switches, like you're not switching your blood elf from being a priest into a shaman into a warlock or whatever. But it is starting to look like it's the sort of thing where effectively mechanically we might end up in a state that's very similar, where you just log off of your warlock, log onto your shaman instead. And now, yes, you have made that switch. And even in Final Fantasy, you still have to level up those jobs, but maybe the content that you have access to is something that will be more account wide. The different gearing options that you have, if it's something where like they have this warbound gear now, if you can trade gear between your characters more regularly to the point where, yeah, I have a I have a warlock and now I want to level my mage. Maybe you can even just move some gear from your warlock over to your mage and say, yeah, I'll just use this same stuff. I don't have to collect the same items twice. That's the sort of thing that could be really interesting to see Blizzard start to embrace more with the warbands feature. And in general, I'm just really hoping this is a feature that we continue to see them fleshing out with more and more stuff being added to it in the future. Like, I'm just saying, the opportunity for player housing here with your warband, where you have your different characters and you've built your own little like fortress or whatever for all of them, or even it's just like your war camp or something where, yeah, you can go in and you can log on to one of those characters and you can go to your war camp and you can customize it a little bit here and there. You put things around and so on and so forth. Like, I think that would be super cool. People have been clamoring for some form of player housing in World of Warcraft for decades now. I'm hoping that we eventually see something along those lines, or at the very least, some more methods of cross-character customization that expands the warband into its own thing and not just a generic term that means account-wide. Moving on, I have some brief thoughts about the hero talents. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the specifics of the actual builds and the talents themselves just yet. We're going to save that for future topics as we get a chance to actually get in there and play with them. But that's actually kind of the core of what I want to talk about, is the chance to get in and actually play with them. That's going to be pretty substantial. Like, it's one thing to look at a blog and be like, okay, I think I see how this is coming together. This seems interesting. This is how this kind of is meant to play. And that's one thing, but actually getting in there and using the hero talents and actually testing them is another thing entirely. And what's really cool is, from what we're seeing so far from the coverage of the early alpha, Blizzard is really, really trying to get ahead of this and get as much of this into players' hands as soon as possible so that they can get as much feedback as they possibly can. They're recognizing that this is probably, like, hero talents is probably the make or break feature for the War Within. Like, this is the big deal feature for the expansion. And so this needs as much time for iteration and feedback as possible. One lesson that they learned from Battle for Azeroth, for example, was the Azerite armor was something that it was a cool concept at its core. It was a cool concept, and there was some cool stuff that was going on with it. But it was added into the alpha and the beta so late in the process that there wasn't time to iterate on the core mechanics of it, to the point where most of the feedback that was received about the Azerite armor for the first release of Battle for Azeroth basically just led to them saying, okay, we just kind of need to just move away from the system entirely because we can't go back and fix it at this point. It was too late in development for them to be able to make the sort of substantial changes that were necessary. And that's not a problem with the designer. Like, I know the designer that worked on at least the lead designer who was working on Azerite armor. They're very, very good designers. And a lot of the systems that people over the years have been like, yes, this is a great system. Like, even when Azerite armor was being complained about, people were like, get rid of the designer who made Azerite armor and bring in the designer who made this other thing instead. And it was the same person. That's the sort of thing that it just is, like, the way that Blizzard makes games, and I think is a good way to make games, is by putting something out there and getting feedback on it so that you can say, okay, we knew that this wasn't going to be perfect the first time. We knew that this was not exactly what it has to be. This was not the final product at all. Let's get it out there knowing that things are going to be wrong. And that way we can see in what ways and to what extent those things are wrong, so that as we adjust them, we have more information and more knowledge of the adjustments that need to be made in order to make that exist and make that be something that's actually good. So it's great that Blizzard is really pushing to get the hero talents testable as soon as possible in the War Within, because that just means even more time for them to be able to look at the system. They have time if they need to make some sort of like under the hood, like substantial change to the way that it even works. They have time to do that, but also they have ways to be like, they have time to be like, okay, this whole concept for this tree isn't working. Let's yeet that and we'll do a different one. There's time for that sort of feedback to still be acted on. So great to see that they're putting all of this effort into the hero talent so early in the alpha. One new piece of information that we just got today, well, today for me, yesterday for you watching this video, if you're watching on YouTube, is that they are finally actually going to go ahead and convert rated Battlegrounds and the Battleground experience, the rated Battleground experience. They're going to convert that into an 8v8 environment. So RBGs will be 8v8 going forward. And this is something that's been talked about and theorized about. And there's been so many like community groups that have put these together in the past and had RBG tournaments where they were like, you're only going to have 8-player teams for this. And it's been super promising so many times over the years. So it's really cool to see them finally actually making that change in the game itself and really embracing this 8v8 mentality. I do hope that we get some like UI adjustments to it. Like it would be weird if you end up with a group of 5 and a group of 3. Like that's just, I don't know. Part of me just really hates that idea. At least do like 2 groups of 4 if that's going to occur. But I really feel like this move towards 8v8 for RBGs is a promising one and a good one. And they've been talking, Ian especially has been talking about how Battlegrounds just kind of feel like quintessential WoW PvP to him. Now, I love arenas, and I'm not ever going to feel like arenas are not PvP. I will never say that. I don't feel that way. To me, arenas are like, well, they have been the core of WoW Esports at the very least for a long time. There's been other sorts of WoW Esports that have come along, but arenas are very core to that. And the way that arenas are played, there's that fine tuning to it and that high level of skill that goes into playing arenas at a top level that I find really, really fascinating and exciting. That's why I was commentating arena tournaments for so long. That said, I still understand the angle where, while arenas almost feel like a 3v3 duel essentially, or a 5v5, 2v2 in the past, but primarily 3v3 nowadays, duel in a sense. Battlegrounds feel a lot more like the essence of MMO PvP. There's an objective and there's something going on, and there's enough people that are going on around you. There's enough people that are on your team and on the other team that it feels more like MMO PvP in that sense. So I fully understand that. I fully get that. It does still ask the question, however, of how viable are Battlegrounds for esports? And the unfortunate reality is that 8-player teams are that's just too big for a team, for an esport to really thrive. There are some games that have pushed it fairly well in the past. And in fact, even inside WoW, there have been these tournaments that have occurred in the past where they got a little bit of traction. It's just, especially once you start thinking about things like in-person events, you start thinking about like, how do you split a prize pool and so on. Splitting that among 8 people and trying to find like lodging and enough computers for 8-player teams on either side. Like it does get to be a bit much. It starts to become a lot that makes it difficult for those to ever really get off the ground entirely. I'm hoping that what we can see in this case is more the like starting off with the grassroots approach and starting off with like purely online events, because it's much easier to get somebody to just play play rated Battlegrounds for a little while. I'm not editing that out. I've already made so many cuts in this episode. I'm not doing that. But it's one thing to have them just log on and play a Battleground for a little while. It's another thing entirely to get 8 people to travel all at the same time. And especially when you start dealing with like international tournaments and stuff, you've got visas and everything to worry about on that. Logistics just get out of hand. So I'm hoping that we can see with this a lot more of a push towards those sorts of one-off online events, maybe even smaller leagues and so on that can start to occur. And that can grow into something that would be really, really cool to see later grow into something much larger. Couple other little things. One thing that really stuck out to me in the Wowcast video that they put out today is the new quest bangs that they're putting together, so that there's more of a differentiation between what type of quest each NPC is asking you to go on. And for me, this is actually like, it's a relatively minor change, but it's actually huge. If you remember in my video where I was talking about why I haven't been playing Dragonflight, one of my big problems trying to get back into Dragonflight as a player was that I logged in and there were like, it felt like there's a ton of people just standing around you in Valdrakken or wherever you happen to be. And they all have something for you to want to do. And it's really difficult to tell what is the most important stuff to you. So they're adding these quest bangs where there's actually an indication like, yes, this is an important quest. It doesn't necessarily say why it's important right away, but you can go and talk to them and you'll figure it out pretty quickly. Or you'll have quests that are just like regular quests. And it's not necessarily a campaign quest. It's not like it's different from all of that. There's even things that they're showing for daily quests and so on. I really love this. I really hope that this works out fairly well. What I would really love to see on top of this is some sort of filter option to where I can say, okay, only show me the important quests or only show me the daily quests. Because when I go to a new zone or when I log into the game after having been away for a little while, it would be nice to like not only just necessarily see what these things are, but also be able to hide the ones that I'm not interested in at the time, just to reduce the visual clutter and make it easier for me to feel like I'm not being overwhelmed by a ton of different NPCs asking me to do different things. I really feel like, especially the way Ian described it, he said they were looking at the map and they felt like they had icon soup. It would help a lot with that icon soup problem to just be able to get rid of some of those icons. And I don't just mean on the map. I also mean like, let me filter out daily quests. And then I don't even see the bangs over people's heads anymore. They talked a little bit about these new profession work orders. There will actually be work orders available from NPCs so that there's always essentially somebody trying to buy things. This kind of came from the angle of them talking about. Now, I haven't, like I said, I haven't been playing Dragonflight as much, so I haven't felt this myself personally, but I understand where it's coming from. This angle of being frustrating as a crafter, just scrambling and trying to keep up, like constantly refreshing the work order list, or there's a new one, so you're basically racing against other people to be able to fill this work order before somebody else fills it. I can understand the frustration of trying to make that happen. So this idea that they're adding in the War Within is that there will just always be some minimum number of work orders for various different items. So you always know that there are things that you can craft and then make some sort of profit off of, or at least sell them. I guess they never actually say if it would be profitable for you to do that. That'll depend a little bit on the material cost for making the things, but at the very least, there will always be some sort of something that if you craft it, you can then sell it to people. The other part of this that makes this interesting to me is it means that Blizzard now has a little bit more of a way to have a direct hand on how much things cost and how much things sell for. Because obviously there will be some value that is associated with these work orders. Now, they did say that their intent is for them to be less lucrative than selling to another player, which makes sense. But this means that they can at least adjust that floor. They can make sure that, like, okay, if you're going to craft this hat, like say there's a work order for this specific hat, and if you're crafting this hat, this is the absolute minimum that this will ever sell for, because if a player lists it for lower than that price, you're just going to sell to the NPC instead. And that could be especially helpful if some of these work order items that are available, I don't know if they're planning to, I doubt they're planning to make them for every single item. It sounds more like it's going to be that there will be specific items that these NPCs list these work orders for. But in that case, as long as some of those items at the very least are ones that are pretty good for just leveling your professions, this will help solve the problem of something getting flooded on the auction house and the price of it bottoming out like instantly, just because like everyone was making this item to level their blacksmithing or whatever. And so now they're just trying to get rid of it to get something back for it, even though it's technically at a loss. We're actually seeing this a lot in Season of Discovery right now, where people have been leveling blacksmithing and they've been selling mithril spurs, and they're selling the mithril spurs for way less than the cost of the actual materials that go into them, which just means that mithril spurs, you're never going to be able to actually craft and sell mithril spurs to another player for profit, because there's so many of them flooding on the auction house. So this is the sort of thing that can help avoid that flood from ever actually happening by setting a minimum price for it, in which case then you can ensure that these items are still valuable, and Blizzard can have a little bit more control over that. We saw some new footage of Aehad today, which is the Nerubian city that we'll be able to go and explore in the War Within. And what's interesting is the number of comparisons to Suramar that have been made with this. So this is starting to feel more like it's a city, but it's also kind of a quest zone. But like, there's a few questions that comes up with as well. Like, are there going to be friendly areas of Aehad, for example? Are there some Nerubians that, like maybe a sub-faction of Nerubians that we are able to interact with and be friendly towards? Is it something where as we progress through the expansion and as the story of the War Within's expansion continues to be told, maybe parts of the city become friendly and parts of it remain in enemy control? Or maybe there's so many other things that could happen here in this case when you look back to Suramar as the sort of template that it came from. So that's very interesting. I personally am hoping that we do get to see some friendly Nerubians at some point, just because the Nerubians are a part of WoW that I've always been very, very interested in the story and lore surrounding them. And I want to be able to explore that a bit more. And one thing that will actually help with them being able to lead into this Nerubian theme a lot more that they announced today, again, yesterday, if you're watching this on YouTube, is that they're actually adding an Arachnophobia mode into World of Warcraft. Now, the concept of an Arachnophobia mode is something that's been a lot more popular in recent years. Like, even looking at games like Lethal Company, for example, there's an Arachnophobia mode in Lethal Company. It's hilarious. It just replaces the spider with the giant word spider that has a couple of fangs. It's amazing. I leave it on just because it's funny. But in this case, in World of Warcraft's Arachnophobia mode, it will replace all of the spider or spider-like characters with crabs or crab-like characters. Now, me personally, I don't have arachnophobia. I do have another weird phobia, though. So and I'm not going to tell you what it is, because every time I tell people what this other weird phobia of mine is, immediately people start trying to trigger it. And I need you to understand that I don't like it. I don't like it. So I understand fully, and I very much sympathize with people who do have arachnophobia and that sort of skin crawly, like, oh God, this is the most uncomfortable thing I've ever experienced feeling that sort of washes over you when whatever your phobia is occurs to you. I totally understand and sympathize with it. So I'm happy to see this coming into the game so that people who have that phobia are able to approach the War Within and actually play it and enjoy it. It is a little funny to turn them all into crabs. It actually not occurred to me that crabs were okay, because crabs, in my mind, crabs are just spiders of the sea, essentially. But apparently, that's not how this phobia works. Apparently, they're still fine. So, okay, crabs it is. They do look to be some of the older crab models, so hopefully that won't end up taking away too much from the overall like feel and flow of going through the questing and the story of the expansion. I'm also curious if there's ever like there's bound to be some relatively central Nerubian characters that there will then be in-game cinematics for. Do they then just become crabs that just stand there and say their lines? I don't know. It could be interesting to see how all that works out in practice. Regardless, even if it is something where you end up getting a slightly lower quality experience because of these crab models, that's still going to be a higher quality experience than if you were freaking out about the spider the whole time. So I do appreciate the arachnophobia mode coming in. We're going to look at it anyway as soon as I get access to the War Within Alpha, because it sounds, at the very least, kind of funny to see them all being crabs. There's been some screenshots of like Maxna from Naxxramas floating around on Twitter, and they're very funny. And I do want to talk a little bit about the concept of story, or at least the storytelling in the War Within as well, before we wrap up this video. Now, I'm not going to get into any spoilers at all here. You don't have to worry about that. I will probably have relatively spoilery videos in the future, but this isn't one of them. We're not going to get into any spoilers here. I more want to talk about the position that Blizzard now finds themselves in, coming off of an expansion like Dragonflight and going into this already announced trilogy, essentially, of expansions. Dragonflight essentially seems to have largely just been its own little bubble. Like it had its own story, wasn't really related to anything that went on prior to that in the Shadowlands, and it doesn't really seem to have too much in terms of a direct tie-in to the beginning of the War Within. I kind of expect that like during the pre-patch event, we'll probably get some like little flow in there, and this like Dark Heart event that's coming up as well. Sounds like it's going to start laying some of that groundwork. But again, that actually sounds more like it's going to be along the lines of, yeah, Dragonflight's story is done. Here's the new story that we're starting to tell with the War Within. So Dragonflight has kind of just been its own little bubble, which honestly, I think was a good thing. It was kind of a palate cleanser coming off of Shadowlands, but it's not really tying too much into what's going on. And before Dragonflight, there was kind of a like threaded story that had been going through several expansions, but it kind of started with Mists of Pandaria. Like Garrosh technically existed prior to that, but this wasn't really like a central narrative. It was more just like at the end of each expansion, there was something that occurred that led into the beginning of the new one. So end of Mists of Pandaria, Garrosh escapes. He creates this time paradox thing, and that's how Warlords of Draenor starts. But then Garrosh is basically killed off during a quest in Nagrand in Warlords of Draenor. End of Warlords of Draenor. Now Gul'dan escapes. Alternate history. Gul'dan escapes. That leads directly into the story of Legion, but Gul'dan gets killed off in the first raid. Then end of Legion. Sargeras stabs the world, leaves this giant sword. And oh my God, now the world is bleeding. Battle for Azeroth occurs. And then Battle for Azeroth. By the end of that, Sylvanas is now up to something. Oh God, we finally know what she's up to. And that starts off Shadowlands. Those were storytelling methods to just kind of keep a narrative going between the expansions. But I wouldn't really call that a central theme. It wasn't really like a specific story being told that spanned all those expansions. It was just, here's how this story ended, and those events then kick off this new story as a way to sort of tie the two together. Not really like a central narrative. That's not what they're trying to do with the War Within, going into Midnight, going into The Last Titan, where we actually have this whole World Soul saga that's meant to be essentially a trilogy that is the same overarching story being told across 3 smaller stories. And that's really interesting in terms of what we can expect to see going throughout the War Within and how they're setting all of this stuff up. Telling a story across a trilogy is actually pretty hard, because you need the person that you're telling the story to, even ignoring video games for a second, looking at something like Star Wars. Here, we're going to spoil Star Wars again. If you look at the original Star Wars trilogy, they had A New Hope, which ended, oh, we destroyed the Death Star. Hooray. Sorry for spoiling a 50-year-old movie. Then we had The Empire Strikes Back. Oh God, destroying the Death Star didn't end the entire Empire threat. Oh my God, now the Empire is doing things. And that led into Return of the Jedi and blah, 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 blah. There you go from there. It was a story that each individual part of it, The Empire Strikes Back was definitely like a between story, but each individual part of it was its own like relatively complete story in that aspect. What Blizzard's going to have to do with The War Within, into Midnight, into The Last Titan, is not only create a story that feels like each almost stanza of it is part of each chapter of it is part of a complete and total overall story, but they also need to make sure that they don't make the players aspect, because it's a video game, they need to make sure that the players don't feel like their actions are being nullified by the storytelling as a result. Like, they need ways for the players to still feel like they've achieved some form of victory without constantly getting the rug pulled out from underneath them. Otherwise, what will happen is players start to question, like, is what we're doing even the right thing? Is any of this even make sense? Why are we even doing this? They're just going to turn out to have this be the wrong thing that we've been doing this whole time anyway, because they've got to keep this story going for 2 more expansions. And that'll be especially challenging for The War Within. It's also going to be challenging for Midnight, because they need to be, like I said, avoid having that feel too much like a between story leading into The Last Titan. But I don't know. We're going to learn a lot about that in the very near future. I have seen some spoilers about early things that occur in The War Within that make it sound like we're definitely getting really back into that like real meaty Warcraft style storytelling where crazy stuff happens. I hope they don't go too overboard with it, just because like there's been a lot of times in the past where some crazy stuff has happened and it felt like that was done just to be able to say they did some crazy stuff, like just for the sake of itself and not because it actually made any sense to the narrative and wasn't actually necessary. I'm talking about things like the burning of Teldrassil. Like, this was something that was clearly set up in such a way where it was like, okay, why though? Why this? Why that? And then it had to be reverse explained later on in order to try to make sense in expansion later. I'm hoping they're not setting things up in that way, but again, they've got this whole plan for this whole saga, so hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully things turn out to be just really good core Warcraft storytelling again. Anyway, that's about all the rambling that I've got for today. We are definitely going to be talking a lot more about The War Within in the very near future. Obviously still keeping up with Season of Discovery as well, but like I said in my video a while back, the whole reason that I haven't been playing retail isn't because I don't want to play retail. It's been a combination of feeling overwhelmed by Dragonflight and just being really into Season of Discovery. So as we get closer to The War Within and as we learn more about it, and hopefully, fingers crossed, Blizzard, you know I love you. Please send me one of them alpha keys if you wouldn't mind. Hopefully we'll get some chance to get some hands-on time with it as well. But anyway, I'm out of here for today. Thanks again, everybody, for hanging out. If you haven't yet, please do go and check out my Patreon. It's patreon.com/Devilore. And if you have any questions that you'd like to see my additional comments on, please go ahead and leave them here on this episode. Or if you're a patron, you can go and find the link to the forum in the previous episode of In Search of Answers, because I really want to be able to answer as many questions as I can, give as many thoughts and random bits of feedback as I can as we start coming into this. And that Q&A show is really good for that sort of thing. So please do go and leave those comments, leave those questions in the form on Patreon if you're a patron subscriber. That's it from me. Thanks again, everybody. I'll see you next time.